Hello, everyone. You're listening to Mr. Dar's Nights, where the darkness speaks, and you're never alone, especially when you think you are. Let me tell you a story that will make you question the voice on the radio and the one whispering inside your head. Story 1, there's a kind of silence that only comes after midnight in a town like Larchwood. A stillness so thick, you could hear the electricity humming through the street lamps. Not many people were awake that late, not unless you were working graveyard shifts or you were haunted. And Rick Marlowe? He was both. Rick was the host of Midnight Hour 97.4, a quiet, low-frequency AM station in a town that barely needed radio anymore. His voice had been a fixture of the airwaves for over 15 years. A smooth baritone with a worn-out warmth, like an old leather jacket. He played vinyl, told ghost stories, read local obituaries, and took lonely calls from sleepless strangers. Nothing ever really happened until that first tape arrived. It came in a plain brown envelope, no return address, just "Play Me," scribbled in red marker on the front. At first, Rick thought it was a prank. Teenagers messing around, maybe a mixtape or some lo-fi horror nonsense. But curiosity got the better of him, and he brought it into the booth that night, just after 1:30 a.m., when the lines had gone cold and the static had returned. He pressed the tape into the deck. A hiss, a click, and then a voice. Calm, male, Midwestern accent. Maybe. It didn't sound angry or deranged. It sounded thoughtful, even gentle. "I want to confess something," the voice said, as if speaking directly into Rick's spine. "Not because I feel guilt, not because I want forgiveness, but because someone should know what I've done. You, Rick, you'll understand." Rick froze. His finger hovered over the stop button, but he didn't press it. Her name was Lorraine Kessler. She called into your show on February 19th, 2013. She talked about the full moon. Remember her? "I do. I remember everything. The way her voice trembled, the sound of her breathing when she laughed. She was beautiful even in death." There was a pause. Then the voice continued. "I took her from the bus stop. She was waiting alone. No one saw me. I didn't hurt her right away. We talked. She told me about her dog, Oliver, about her job at the bakery. I listened. I'm always listening. Then I ended her life. Gently, cleanly, like removing a whisper from the air." Rick's throat went dry. He'd known Lorraine. She had lived 2 streets away from the station. She had called in that night. He remembered the soft-spoken girl who talked about watching the moon from her rooftop. They'd found her body days later, dumped behind the lumber mill. No suspects, no leads. Rick rewound the tape, listened again. Then again. There was no background noise, no clear markers of identity. The voice was hauntingly composed. Whoever this was, he wasn't just making things up. He knew details, too many to be coincidence. Rick didn't report it. He wasn't sure why. Maybe it was fear, maybe it was ego, or maybe it was because a part of him needed to hear the rest. The next tape came a week later. Same envelope, same handwriting. This one began differently. The voice said only this: "You're not doing anything, Rick. Good. That means you're ready for another." This time, it was about Malcolm Reyes, a 19-year-old drifter who called in years ago, talking about hitchhiking across state lines. The killer described how he offered him a ride, how they bonded over rock music, how he used a zip tie and chloroform. He didn't scream. The voice said, almost proudly, he was tired of running anyway. Rick started keeping the tapes in a locked drawer. He didn't tell the police, didn't tell the station manager. It became a ritual. Every week, one more tape, one more confession. Each one tied directly to a caller from Rick's own show, and each one colder than the last. One night, a caller phoned in during a commercial break. Line 2, no caller ID. Rick answered, "Midnight Hour, you're live." The voice on the other end said only one thing: "Do you believe in echoes, Rick? Because I think you're starting to hear yours." Then silence. Rick stared at the console. That voice, it was the same as the tapes. Exactly the same. He didn't air the call. He sat there, frozen, the hairs on his arms standing up, sweat pooling at the base of his neck. That night, he took the tapes home. He started listening for patterns, names, background sounds, anything. He laid out a map of the town and marked each victim. Most had no clear connection. Some were transients, others locals. The only thread tying them together was the radio, his show. He tried to be rational. Maybe someone was copying real crimes. Maybe these were fakes, but he knew better. He felt it in his bones. Then came the twist. Tape number 9 changed everything. This one's special, Rick. You'll remember her. You have to. She was your friend. The name that followed knocked the wind out of him. Valerie Jacobs. Valerie had been Rick's college girlfriend. They'd dated for a year. Lost touch. She'd moved to Chicago. He hadn't heard from her in over a decade. There was no way she could be connected, except she had called in 3 years ago. She'd been driving through town, recognized his voice, told him on air, "You still sound like trouble, Marlowe." He'd laughed, told her to stay safe. She said she would. Now, the killer was describing her final moments in brutal detail. She never screamed. She smiled, said she remembered you. She died thinking of you. Rick, isn't that poetic? Rick vomited in the trash bin next to the soundboard. He didn't sleep that night. Or the next. He started playing pre-recorded shows. No more live callers. He couldn't take the risk. The guilt was sinking in like water through rotting wood. Then the police came. They said someone mailed them copies of the tapes. Anonymously. They asked Rick if he'd ever heard the voice before. He lied. Said no. Played dumb. But something was off. They didn't mention Valerie, or Lorraine, or Malcolm. They only had tapes about victims Rick had never heard of. Different names, different voices. The killer had made 2 sets of tapes. Rick realized with mounting horror that the ones he received weren't for public consumption. They were personal, intimate, like journal entries whispered into his ear. Then came the most disturbing part. He started recognizing the background noise in the latest tapes, not just static, but the faint hum of his own radio show, vinyl crackle, his own voice distant, but there, whoever was recording these tapes was doing it while listening to Rick. Real time, close by, too close. He began checking the station log, security footage. Nothing. He asked the janitor if anyone had been coming in late. The janitor just shrugged, said only Rick stayed past midnight anymore. Rick's hand started shaking on air. He was spiraling. Listeners noticed. Emails trickled in. "You okay, Rick? You sound tired. You've been off lately." He considered quitting, leaving town. But then one final tape arrived and it changed everything. No envelope this time. Just a tape left on the passenger seat of Rick's car. Written on it was a single word. Origin. He listened at home, locked in the basement, headphones on. The voice was different now. Still calm, still steady. But there was something else beneath it. Emotion. Almost reverence. "Rick, I want to thank you for creating me, for giving me my voice. Without you, I never would have known what I was capable." Rick paused the tape, heart racing. He hit play again. You remember the orphanage fire in '92? The one on Hawthorne Street. You were a volunteer DJ back then. Played music for the kids every Sunday. One of us never forgot your voice. Rick's blood ran cold. You called me Echo One because I always repeated things you said. Remember? That stuck with me. It became who I am. There was a pause. Breathing. You taught me how to speak. How to hide pain behind calm work. And when the fire happened, you cried. I saw you. That night changed us both. Rick dropped the headphone. He remembered the fire. 11 children had died. One boy was unaccounted for. Never found. They said he might have run away. Or burned. No one knew. But Rick remembered the kid. Pale. Quiet. Always copying things Rick said. Always watching. The tape ended with one final sentence. I've come full circle, Rick. And when I send you the last tape, you'll know what to do. Rick didn't sleep that night. Or the next. He started drinking, shaking during the day. He kept every light in his apartment on, every curtain drawn. He checked every lock twice. And then the final tape arrived. But it wasn't in his mailbox. It was already playing in the booth. You're listening to Mr. Dar's Nights. And tonight, we continue the voice that whispers beyond the static. The deeper Rick digs, the more the signal turns into a scream. Don't adjust your radio. The echo is just beginning to speak. The tape was already spinning when Rick entered the studio. It was just past midnight. Rain tapped gently against a narrow window. The station lights flickered once, then settled into a dull yellow glow. Rick hadn't touched the tape deck, but the reel was moving, slow and steady, as if waiting for him to sit down. So he did. The voice crackled through the speakers like a half-forgotten dream. This will be my final broadcast. Rick, I know you felt it too. The itch in your memory, the pieces clicking into place. I am the echo of something you buried, but the past always plays again. That's the rule of loops. Rick leaned forward, a cold sweat gathering at the base of his spine. The room felt smaller somehow, the air thicker. Tonight, the voice continued, I'll finish the story, and you'll finally understand the ending belongs to you. And then, silence. The tape stopped. Rick stared at the deck, heart pounding. The voice hadn't confessed to a new murder. No names, no dates, just that eerie, cryptic message. It was different this time, as if Echo was trying to say goodbye, or pass the torch. Rick stood, scanned the booth. Nothing seemed out of place, but his gut screamed otherwise. Then he saw it, a folded piece of paper, slipped under the booth door. He bent down and picked it up with trembling fingers. On the outside was a single word, typed, playback. Inside, a location and time, where it started, Hawthorne, 3:17 a.m. Rick didn't need to ask. The burned-down orphanage, the one from 1992, where Echo was born, where something in Rick had died. He stared at the clock, 1:47 a.m. If he left now, he'd get there just in time. The road to Hawthorne Avenue had changed over the years. What used to be dense neighborhoods was now overgrown lots and condemned buildings. Rick drove in silence, windshield wipers beating like a nervous metronome. He didn't put on the radio. He couldn't bear to hear his own voice. When he arrived, the old orphanage stood like a mausoleum of scorched brick and twisted beams. It hadn't been torn down, just forgotten, swallowed by weeds and rot. Windows like empty eyes. The wrought iron gate creaked open with a groan as Rick pushed through. His flashlight swept across the remains. Burned furniture, collapsed staircases, a rusted tricycle lying on its side. And then the sound. A faint click, then hiss, then tape. Somewhere deep inside, a recorder had started playing. Rick followed the noise, heart hammering, through the charred hallway, past the crumbled playroom, into the old rec center, where he used the DJ for the kids every Sunday. There, sitting on a collapsed table, was a battered cassette player, and it was playing. You came. Good. Rick froze. It was the voice again, but not recorded. Live. Turn around, Rick. He turned, and there he was, standing in the shadows, tall, lean, wearing a dark raincoat, his face hidden by a hood. But his presence was unmistakable. The echo. For a moment, neither man spoke. Just the rain on the broken roof above, and the hum of old tape. Then the voice again, no longer distant. I've been waiting a long time for you to remember. Rick stepped back. Who are you? The figure tilted his head. You know me. You just don't want to admit it. Rick shook his head. You're sick. You murdered them, innocent people. The man stepped into the light. Rick gasped. IT wasn't just recognition. It was realization. The man looked just like him. Not an exact mirror, but close enough. Same eyes, same jawline. Younger, paler, like a faded photograph of himself from a life he never lived. You see it now, the man said. What you forgot. Rick's voice cracked. This isn't possible. The man smiled. You never asked why you stopped remembering the fire. Why no one ever confirmed how it started, or how you got out. Rick stumbled back. Memories clawed at his skull like fingernails behind wallpaper. The screaming, the smoke, a child's voice repeating his name. Then nothing. You didn't save me, Echo whispered. You left me. Rick dropped to his knees. The room was spinning. His breath caught in his throat. He remembered now. The fire had started with a game. Rick, just out of high school, working part-time at the orphanage, had brought candles and matches to tell spooky stories to the kids. They laughed. One of them dared another to light the curtain. A small flame, a flash, panic, smoke everywhere. He'd run. He'd left them. And one boy had tried to follow him. The boy he used to call Echo. But he never made it out. Or so Rick had believed. You didn't die, Rick whispered. No, the man said softly. But something else did. He reached into his coat and pulled out a tape recorder. Press play. Rick's own voice filled the space. Laughing. Comforting. Telling a bedtime story to the kids over the orphanage PA system. It was old, warped, but unmistakably him. I've been listening to that every night for 30 years, Echo said. You were my lullaby, my obsession, my teacher, my ghost. Rick stared up at him, eyes wet. What do you want from me? Echo stepped closer. I want you to tell the world. Not about me, about you, about what you did, about how a single voice, yours, can create monsters. Rick's mouth trembled. I didn't mean to. It doesn't matter, Echo said. Meaning means nothing. Action is everything. And now, your final broadcast waits. He tossed Rick a tape. It had no label, just one word carved into the plastic. Truth. Rick returned to the station just before dawn. Hands shaking, eyes bloodshot, face ashen. He didn't speak to anyone, just went straight to the booth, locked the door, slid the tape into the deck, and hit record on the mic. The red light blinked. The on-air sign glowed, and he began. Good morning, Larchwood. This is Rick Marlowe, and this is my final show. His voice wavered, then steadied. I've lied to you for years. I pretended to be the voice of comfort, the late-night companion, but I've been hiding something, something terrible, and someone has been reminding me. He told the story. The fire, the boy, the escape, the guilt. He told them about the tapes, about the voice, about how Echo had risen from the ashes of Rick's own sins and found clarity in murder. And then he played the tape. The truth. It was different from the others. It wasn't Echo speaking. It was Rick, as a young man, reading stories to the orphan, laughing with them, talking about how every voice deserves to be heard. It was haunting. It was beautiful. And it ended with silence. Rick turned off the mic, took off his headphones, and left. That was a week ago. Rick Marlowe disappeared that morning. Left his car at the edge of town. Wallet and keys still inside. No trace. Police searched the station, the orphanage ruins, even dredged the river. Nothing. But the tapes? They kept coming. Not to the police. Not to the station. To homes. Random addresses around Larchwood. Left on doorsteps. Hidden in mailboxes. Each one the same. Rick's voice, confessing, telling stories, whispering apologies, as if he was still broadcasting from somewhere else. And late at night, if you turn your dial just right, you might still hear him. This is Midnight Hour with Rick Marlowe, and tonight we speak of echoes. Rain had returned to Larchwood, falling in a soft, ceaseless rhythm, as if the sky itself was grieving. The town was different now, quieter, paranoid. Radios sat silent on kitchen counters. Late-night hosts across neighboring stations reported calls from people who said they'd heard Rick Marlowe's voice long after his disappearance. But Rick was gone. Wasn't he? Officer Liam Carter didn't believe it. He'd worked the case personally, tracing every breadcrumb Rick had left behind. But the deeper he dug, the more warped things became. Tapes showed up in places Rick couldn't have reached. Timestamps didn't make sense. Voices layered over each other in frequencies no machine could explain. And always that name. Echo. Liam didn't like mystery. He liked patterns, evidence, proof. So when a manila envelope arrived on his desk with no return address, marked only with a smudged fingerprint and the word play, he did exactly that. Inside was a single cassette. No label, no handwriting, just a tape. He borrowed a machine from evidence lockup, sat alone in the back room, and pressed play. At first, silence, then the unmistakable sound of Rick Marlowe clearing his throat. And what followed wasn't a show. It was a confession. I know you're listening, Officer Carter. You've always been thorough. I admired that, even before I knew your name. But this isn't for your files. This isn't about arrests or trials. This is about the truth. Rick's voice was calm, tired. I've realized something about voices. They never truly vanish. They just change frequencies. What we think is silence is often just a signal we're not tuned to hear. And Echo found that frequency. There was a pause. Then a second voice layered beneath his. Familiar. Mirrored. Echo. You see, Liam, I'm not Rick's creation. I'm what's left when guilt festers without release. I'm every word he choked on. Every lie he told to make himself feel clean. I am the consequence of silence. The tape crackled. The volume spiked. Then Rick again. The fire didn't kill Echo. It split him. Half of him died that day in Hawthorne. But the other half, the voice trapped in my head, lived on, whispering, guiding, teaching me how to perform guilt like a stage play. Another pause, and I performed it well. For years, I gave this town comfort, distraction, company in the dark. But all I was really doing was holding a mirror to myself. Every story, every caller, a rehearsal for the final act. Liam leaned forward, chills crawling his spine. Rick continued. Echo started sending the tapes months ago, but not from the present, from the past. I found timestamps. Forensics confirmed some of those cassettes were over 10 years old, recorded before any of the murders happened, which means either I was broadcasting into the future, or the future had already played back the past. Liam stopped the tape, stepped away. His hands were shaking. He didn't know why, but he believed Rick. The next day, Liam returned to the burned orphanage. Something in Rick's words had drawn him there. Like an unfinished sentence in the middle of a story, he stepped over the same gate, walked through the same ashes. In the rec room, he found it, a wall, half collapsed, now revealed a narrow crawl space. Inside, buried beneath dust and soot, were dozens of tapes, labeled with names, dates. Every name matched a murder victim from the last year. But the dates? They were before the killing, weeks, sometimes months before. Each tape was a private recording of the victim's voice, left on Rick's radio show. Late night calls, background noises, laughter, fear. And one thing was clear, Rick hadn't recorded them. Echo had. And Echo had known their names before they died. That night, Liam brought one tape home. He didn't tell anyone. He sat at his kitchen table, lights low, storm outside, and pressed play. It wasn't Rick's voice. It wasn't Echo. It was his own. A call he'd made months ago to Rick's show, on a whim, asking about insomnia, about guilt. He'd never even heard it air. But there it was, Liam, talking into the void. And in the background, barely audible, another voice whispering, soon. He turned it off. Cold crept into his bones like ice water. He understood now. Echo didn't follow victims. Echo chose them. By voice, by frequency, by resonance. And Liam had spoken. Rick's broadcast hadn't ended. Not really. The on-air sign in the studio had been dark for days, but transmissions still leaked through rogue frequencies, pirate signals, short waves. People claimed they heard Rick on their baby monitor, on broken walkie-talkies, even through static on TVs that hadn't worked in years. But it was never just Rick. It was always followed by another voice, the second voice, the echo. One woman claimed she received a call on her landline. No caller ID. She picked up, heard breathing, then a recording of her voice from a radio show 10 years ago, laughing, drunk, confessing to a petty theft. Then the whisper, you lied. She was found dead 3 days later, heart attack, but her phone line kept ringing long after. They say sound never really dies. It just travels forever, bouncing, warping, returning. And in Larchwood, late at night, sound had found a new host. The last tape Rick left behind was found in the mailbox of a college student named Noah Falk. Noah had never called into Rick's show, had never met him, had no connection, except his father did. His father was one of the kids from Hawthorne, a survivor. And the tape? It was his father's voice, as a child, begging to be let out of the burning rec room. Noah played the tape for police. They thought it was a prank, until Noah vanished. Only thing left? A tape recorder on his bed. Still spinning. Still whispering. Officer Liam Carter resigned from the force that week. Left town. No one's heard from him since. But a tape was mailed to the station a month later. It had a single sentence. He spoke, so I listened. Today, Rick's booth at the radio station remains locked. Some say if you put your ear to the glass, you can hear two voices still arguing inside. One trying to forgive, the other never forgetting. The final broadcast never aired, but it's still playing. Just not on any station you can find. Unless, of course, you know the frequency. Story 2. The man who murdered without touching. The first death was dismissed as coincidence. It happened inside courtroom 3B of the St. Lawrence County Courthouse, a stuffy, cold chamber where the echo of wooden benches could swallow up a whisper. It was supposed to be a minor hearing, a property dispute between two brothers. Barely enough drama to interest the court clerk. But halfway through proceedings, as the plaintiff's full name was read aloud, first, middle, last, he collapsed. No scream. No convulsion, just silence. Eyes rolled back, dead before his head hit the floor. Heart attack, the coroner ruled. Open and shut. Only it wasn't, because exactly 1 week later, in the same courtroom, another man died. Same circumstances, same posture, same final moment. His name read aloud by the defense during a closing statement. The name echoed off the wood-paneled walls like a ritual. And once again, death. Detective Mark Harlan didn't believe in patterns unless they had weight. He hated buzzwords like serial and copycat. His job was to chase facts, not shadows. But when the fifth unexplained courtroom death hit his desk, he paused. All 5 victims had no known heart conditions. All 5 collapsed seconds after someone said their full names aloud in courtroom 3B. And all 5 cases had one man in common, Silas Wren. He wasn't a judge, not a lawyer, not a clerk. He was just there. Always seated in the gallery, never speaking, never testifying, but always present on the day of death. And most importantly, he had read the names. The court transcripts told a haunting tale. In each case, at some point in the trial, Silas Wren had been called as a witness or a representative. And each time, when asked to confirm the identity of the plaintiff or defendant, he had spoken the name first, middle, last. 3 seconds later, death. Detective Harlan interviewed him in person. Silas was polite, soft-spoken, dressed in gray like a man who had studied grief for decades. I don't remember the names, he said, voice flat. They give them to me. I just read what they hand me. Who gives them to you? He didn't answer, just smiled. People want justice, Silas said. Sometimes the law needs a little help. There was no evidence, no threats, no weapon. Just a man with a pocket notebook and an impeccable memory for full legal names, and a courtroom that now held the quiet of a morgue. Then came the 9th death, a woman named Cheryl Platt, middle-aged, healthy, well-loved by her co-workers at the DMV. She was being sued for a workplace incident, slipped paperwork, nothing violent. Silas Wren was listed as a character witness. The transcript from that trial sent Harlan cold. Judge, Mr. Wren, can you confirm the name of the defendant? Silas, Cheryl and Platt. Judge, and do you believe she intended to harm her co-worker? Silas, no, but intent doesn't cleanse a name. Plaintiff gasps. Silence. Cheryl collapsed 5 seconds later. Mark requested Silas be barred from the courthouse, but there was no legal cause. Silas hadn't broken a single law. He's just speaking, the DA said. Mark wasn't convinced. He started digging into Silas's past. Nothing came up. No criminal record, no birth certificate, no schooling. Just one detail. A tiny obituary from 1997 about a boy named Silas Wren, age 10, who drowned in a lake in Maine. Same name, same birthday. But the man Detective Harlan had spoken to was in his late 40s. So who was this Silas? The turning point came when Harlan received an anonymous letter. No return address. Inside, a torn page from an old manuscript. No title, just a paragraph. Printed in typewriter ink. To name a soul aloud is to claim it. But if the name is spoken by one who carries the tongue of the dead, then the soul must surrender instantly. It is not murder. It is invocation. Below the passage with photograph, black and white. A courtroom. A man nearly identical to Silas, standing at the witness box. The date stamped on the photo? Detective Mark Harlan stared at the photo until the ink blurred into dust in his mind. Same sharp jawline. Same sunken eyes. The man in the 1912 photo wasn't just similar to Silas Wren. He was Silas Wren, dressed in a three-piece suit, standing with his hand on a Bible in an old courtroom that had long since burned down in a courthouse fire decades ago. Mark flipped the photo over. One line was typed on the back. He doesn't age. He collects names. That night, Mark didn't sleep. He sat in his dim kitchen, lights off, just the hum of the refrigerator and the weight of that photo pressed between his fingers. He didn't believe in curses, rituals, or ancient tongues. He believed in men with motives. But this was something else. 9 people were dead, and no one could touch the killer because he never laid a hand on them, and yet they died all the same. The next morning, Mark drove to the courthouse again, not for a case, not for an interview. He wanted to sit in courtroom 3B. Alone, he needed to feel it, the shape of the room, the smell of polished wood and faded history. Maybe it would tell him something. The courtroom was empty. Dust floated in columns of sunlight spilling through the high windows. Mark sat in the third row, where Silas often sat. He imagined a voice, calm, soft, deliberate, speaking names like they were spells. There was no physical evidence, no surveillance footage showing anything unusual. But when Mark sat there, he noticed something odd. The acoustics. Even a whisper bounced differently in this room. It stretched longer, echoed softer. It wasn't just design, it felt amplified, as if this room wasn't built for justice, but for something far older, far stranger. He leaned forward and whispered his own name, Mark Eli Harlan. It came back to him like a breath from the wall. He left the courthouse more disturbed than when he entered. Back at the station, he went through Silas Wren's known appearances. Surprisingly, Silas had a long history of showing up at trials, going back at least 20 years. Never as a criminal, always as a witness, character reference, or even sometimes a translator. But there was no record of who had summoned him or how he ended up in each case. Worse, in almost every one of those cases, someone died, not always in court, sometimes a week later, sometimes in their sleep, but always of heart failure. No physical contact, no fingerprints, no foul play, just a name spoken aloud. Mark reached out to a former FBI profiler named Jeb Kinney, retired gruff, but known for cracking some of the darkest domestic serials in the 90s. Kinney called back within hours. "You're talking about a mnemonic predator," he said. "A what?" "A man who kills through suggestion, through ritual. Rare. I've only seen one other case even close to what you're describing." Kinney emailed him a scan of an old federal report marked archived, unresolved. It was from 1954. A judge in Illinois had collapsed during a trial. 2 jurors died the next day. All had heard the defendant, a man named Solomon Knox, speak the victim's name aloud in court. Same eerie rhythm, same calm voice. And Solomon Knox vanished during recess. He was never found. The attached sketch of Knox wasn't perfect, but the resemblance to Silas Wren was undeniable. Even had the same lazy left eyelid. Mark's stomach turned. This wasn't a man. This was something wearing the idea of a man. A week passed. Mark attended a new trial. Nothing major. Property theft, one witness. No media. But when he saw Silas walk into courtroom 3B and quietly take a seat, the air shifted. Mark stood up from the gallery. "Objection!" he shouted. The judge frowned. "Detective Harlan, you're not part of these proceedings. I need to speak to court. Now." The judge hesitated, recognizing the urgency in Mark's voice. "You have 1 minute." Mark turned to the courtroom. "That man," he said, pointing at Silas, "has been present at 9 unexplained deaths in this room. And every time, it happened seconds after he spoke a full name." Gasps rose. Silas didn't move, just blinked slowly, like he was waiting for Mark to finish. "I'm asking this court to bar him from entering until further investigation is complete." The judge looked at Silas. "Mr. Wren, do you have anything to say?" Silas finally stood. "I understand your concern, detective," he said softly, "but I am not the blade. I'm merely the voice that carries the sentence." He turned toward the judge. "Your Honor, your full name is Michael Landenhowell." The courtroom fell dead silent. The judge clutched his chest and fell sideways. Chaos erupted. People screamed. Mark leapt over the railing, shouting for paramedics. The judge was dead before anyone touched him. Silas didn't run. He stood calmly as police tackled him. But by the time they got him to the station, he was no longer speaking. Wouldn't say a word. They put him in solitary. No phone calls. No conversation. Only Mark was allowed to question him. In the interrogation room, Mark stared through the one-way glass. Silas sat quietly, hands folded, like he'd been waiting centuries for this moment. Mark entered. "Sat down. I know what you are," he said. Silas didn't blink. "I know about the name ritual, about the voice, about Solomon Knox in 1954. You've done this before." Silas finally spoke. "Names are the oldest weapon, detective. Before there were guns or knives, there were names. The true name of the soul binds it, chains it, kills it. Why the courtroom? Because that's where names are made sacred. First, middle, last. Read aloud in judgment. It's the perfect altar." Mark leaned in. "How do we stop you?" "You don't," Silas said. "You just choose whether your name will be remembered or erased." Then he smiled. "You should have never said your own name in that room." Mark froze. "What?" "In courtroom 3B, Silas whispered. "You spoke it. I heard it echo back. It's already begun." That night, Mark collapsed in his home. But he didn't die. He awoke hours later, drenched in sweat, heart hammering. Not dead, but changed. When he looked in the mirror, his voice sounded different. He whispered his name. It didn't echo. It absorbed. Mark stopped using his name. He avoided signing documents, skipped phone calls, and began sleeping in short bursts, haunted by a strange whisper in his ear each time he closed his eyes. The voice wasn't Silas's. It was his own, whispering, "Mark Eli Harlan," over and over, like a warning or a curse. The mirror no longer reflected just his image. It shimmered faintly, like something else was watching from the other side. He realized it wasn't just about hearing your name in the courtroom. It was about claiming it aloud. Silas hadn't lied. Mark had cursed himself the moment he whispered his full name in 3B. But something else was happening. He hadn't died. That meant he still had time, a chance to reverse it. Or worse, maybe he wasn't dying because Silas didn't want him dead. Not yet. He needed answers. Real ones. Mark took a leave of absence from the department under the guise of burnout. His colleagues accepted it without question. He looked like hell after all. Gaunt, pale, with dark rings forming under his eyes and a persistent twitch in his left hand. Instead of resting, he drove out to a crumbling monastery tucked deep in the New Mexico desert. It was a place Kinney had mentioned, an old spiritual order that believed words had power over the soul. Monks there had once practiced a ritual called the unnaming, a method of removing one's identity from the spiritual world to escape demons, curses, and even death. Mark didn't believe in demons, but he did believe in Silas, and Silas was worse. The monastery wasn't abandoned. One monk remained, an old man with eyes like scorched glass and a voice so soft it seemed to fall apart before it reached your ears. He said his name had been forgotten, purposely. "I burned it from parchment," the monk whispered, "and from memory. Even my brothers do not know it. Can you teach me how to do it?" Mark asked. The monk nodded. But there was a price. 3 days. That's how long the ritual took. On the first day, Mark was instructed to write his name on 99 slips of parchment. one for every breath he'd taken that still tied him to the world. The monk made him carry the slips through a windstorm and scatter them into the desert, one by one, without speaking. On the second day, Mark was told to speak his name aloud into a shallow well, and then drink the water that reflected it. He vomited within minutes. The water turned dark like ink. On the third day, the monk brought him to a stone altar etched with symbols older than Latin, older than God. He told Mark to lie on the altar and listen. Do not speak, only listen. Mark obeyed, and what he heard wasn't language. It was something beneath language, a hum, a low, endless vibration, like the memory of a sound too ancient to be understood. The monk began to chant. Mark felt his bones vibrate. His breath caught in his throat, and then silence. His name was gone. He could feel it, like someone had taken a pair of scissors and cut the string that held him to the world. He returned to the city that same night. No one recognized him. When he walked into the precinct, the front desk officer looked up blankly. "Can I help you?" Mark opened his mouth to respond, and nothing came out. He hadn't just erased his name. He'd erased his voice. Silas, however, was still in custody. Somehow, they hadn't been able to charge him. He hadn't technically broken any laws. The judge's death was natural causes, no matter what anyone believed. But for now, he was being held for a psychological evaluation. Mark stood outside the glass of the observation room. Silas sat alone inside, his lips moving, though no sound came out. He was rehearsing, preparing. Mark walked in. Silas looked up, eyes narrowing. "Ah," he said, "you've changed." Mark didn't respond. Silas tilted his head. "You removed your name. Clever, but not enough. You think you've escaped me, but you've only muted the blade. The wound is still there." Mark placed a folder on the table. Inside were photographs, all from past cases, all connected by one detail. Silas had been there. Silas chuckled. "You found them all." Mark flipped to the last photo. It was from 1896. Silas, standing beside a noose, smiling. "You can't be human," Mark finally said. His voice returned for just a moment. Maybe because he wasn't Mark anymore. Maybe because the ritual had changed him. Silas smiled. "I'm not a man," he whispered. "I'm a sentence, spoken in the first tongue. And you're now a blank page." That night, 3 people died. All jurors from a trial Silas had once attended. All of heart failure. Mark rushed back to the station. Silas hadn't left the cell. No contact with the outside world. But the names had been spoken already. They were simply delayed, like a song cued on an invisible playlist. Mark stood outside the holding room and stared at Silas through the glass. "Why are you doing this?" he mouthed silently. Silas shrugged. "Because justice is a lie," he said. "But names never lie. They carry the truth of what someone is, and I strip it from them, name by name." Mark had one last idea, one last shot. He went to the courthouse, courtroom 3B. He brought a canister of gasoline and a match. As the flames curled across the ceiling, he whispered a final prayer, not to God, but to the void where his name used to live, and the fire burned clean. No smoke alarms, no fire crews, just silence, and then laughter. The laughter came from the reflection in the broken courtroom mirror, but it wasn't Mark. It was Silas, already waiting on the other side. "You burned the altar," the voice said, "but the words live on." And then something began to write itself across the soot-blackened wall in ashes. Mark Eli Harlan. Mark ran. But no matter how far he got, he couldn't outrun the sound of his own name. It followed him, whispered on empty winds, echoed in cracks in the pavement. And one day, While crossing a street at 3:17 a.m., Mark paused, turned his head, and smiled because he finally understood the truth. The only way to kill a name was to speak a new one in its place. And Silas? Silas had just whispered his own name for the first time. Story 3. Room 313, the hotel where they vanish. The faded neon sign flickered weakly, casting an eerie glow across the cracked asphalt. The Silver Pines Motel, a relic of a past long forgotten, stood on a desolate stretch of highway in the middle of nowhere. Its peeling paint and sagging roof gave the impression that it had been abandoned for years. But like everything else in the desolate desert landscape, it remained stubbornly intact, untouched by time or the relentless winds. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of stale cigarettes and dust, the only sound the hum of a ceiling fan overhead. The lobby was dimly lit, the walls lined with pictures of places long gone, faded and yellowed from years of neglect. A desk sat in the corner, and behind it, a bell that hadn't been touched in decades. The bell sat there like a forgotten promise, its polished brass tarnished and dim. As the bell rang, a shuffling sound came from the back. The motel's lone occupant, an old man with crooked glasses and a hunched back, appeared. His eyes were vacant, glazed over with years of unseen memories, and he wore a permanent frown as though the weight of the world rested on his shoulders. "You check in?" he asked, his voice hoarse from disuse. The two podcasters standing before him nodded, their bags slung over their shoulders. They had been on the road for days, traveling from one dead-end story to the next, chasing the thrill of uncovering unsolved mysteries. But this one was different. The Silver Pines Motel had been on their radar for months now, a place of urban legend and whispered rumors. Room 313. "Yeah, we're here for the story," Mark said, his voice filled with an eager anticipation. His partner, Eliza, stood beside him, her eyes scanning the lobby as she fiddled with the strap of her camera bag. The old man didn't say a word. He simply handed them the key, a dull brass object with the number 313 etched into it. Mark took it without hesitation, feeling a chill run through his fingers as he touched the cold metal. "Rooms down the hall. Second door on the left," the old man mumbled, his eyes flicking to the cracked walls. "You won't be back." Mark chuckled nervously, as did Eliza, but the man's expression remained unchanged. They moved toward the hallway, the air growing colder with each step. The place felt abandoned, even though they knew it was far from it. The rooms were rented out. Guests checked in, but none seemed to check out. Room 313. The curse of the motel had been the subject of countless online theories, podcasts, and amateur investigations. People came, and they vanished, just like the rumors said. No one knew why, and no one could explain it. The police had investigated, but every lead went cold. The only clue left behind was the audio equipment, still running, still recording, but capturing only static and distorted voices. The hallway seemed to stretch endlessly in front of them. Each door was numbered with chip paint, each one looking identical to the last. But there was something about the air here, something off. The walls seemed to close in as they approached their destination. Room 313, they reached the door, and Mark hesitated for a moment, his hand hovering over the handle. Eliza, sensing his unease, shot him a reassuring look. They had done this before, investigated strange occurrences, mysterious disappearances, but this time felt different. It wasn't just the reputation of the motel. It was a sense of something waiting inside. The key turned in the lock with an audible click. Mark pushed open the door, and they stepped inside. The room was small, barely big enough for the bed, a dresser, and a small desk with a chair. The carpet was worn, the once bright colors now muted by years of foot traffic. A thick layer of dust coated every surface, as though no one had stepped foot in here for years. The wallpaper was peeling in spots, revealing a grimy underlayer of yellowing plaster. It was eerily silent. No creaks, no whispers, just the quiet hum of the air conditioning that barely worked. Eliza set her camera bag on the desk and began to unpack her equipment. Mark did the same, placing their microphones, recorder, and laptop on the bed. "This place is a dump," Eliza muttered as she wiped a layer of dust off the dresser. Mark nodded, glancing around. "It's perfect for our podcast. You can practically feel the history in this room. It's like the place has been frozen in time." He moved the window and pulled back the heavy curtains, revealing a barren stretch of highway. The stars above seemed too bright, like they were watching them, waiting for something to happen. A cold breeze blew through the cracked window, and Mark shivered, pulling the curtains shut. "We should get started," Eliza said, setting up a recorder. Let's get some audio for the intro. Just basic stuff, right? Mark agreed. He hit record on the laptop and turned to face Eliza. All right, here we are, Mark began, his voice steady and professional. Room 313, the Silver Pines Motel, a place steeped in mystery and rumors, a place where people come and never leave. Tonight, we're going to spend the night here and see if we can uncover the truth behind the strange disappearances. Let's see if we can make sense of the madness. Eliza nodded, her eyes scanning the room as she adjusted the camera. Some say the room is cursed. Some say it's the spirits of the vanished guests who never left. But there's one thing we know for sure. There's something wrong with room 313. And tonight, we're going to find out what. The air seemed to grow heavier as the words left their mouths, like something invisible had shifted. Its presence now felt in the room. Mark set the recorder on the nightstand, and they settled in for the night. The hours dragged on, the silence between them growing thick and uncomfortable. The hum of the air conditioner was the only sound, a constant reminder of their isolation in this place. But as the night wore on, something changed. The temperature in the room dropped. The hairs on the back of Mark's neck stood on end, and he couldn't shake the feeling that they were no longer alone. Then the static started. A faint crackle on the recorder, a sound that seemed to come from nowhere, like a whisper from far away. Eliza glanced at Mark, her face pale. "Did you hear that?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Mark nodded, his heart racing. "Yeah, I heard it." The static grew louder and the whispers followed. Low, unintelligible words that seemed to swirl in the air like a storm. Mark scrambled to adjust the recorder, but it was no use. The sound was coming from everywhere. Suddenly, the whispers stopped, and then a voice. It was distorted, garbled, but clear enough to understand. "Leave. Now, or you will join us." The room seemed to pulse with energy, the walls closing in. The temperature dropped even further, and Mark felt a chill settle deep in his bones. Eliza was already standing, her eyes wide with fear. "We need to get out of here," she said, her voice trembling. But it was too late. The door slammed shut with a deafening crash, trapping them inside, and the recorder continued to record. The door to room 313 slammed shut with a force that rattled the walls. Mark's heart thudded in his chest, his fingers trembling as he reached for the doorknob. It wouldn't budge. He pulled harder, his muscles straining, but it was as if the door had been welded shut from the other side. "Eliza, try the window," Mark shouted, his voice shaking as he backed away from the door. His mind raced, the sudden tension in the room gripping him tightly. What the hell just happened? Eliza had already made her way to the window. She fumbled with the heavy curtains, her hands cold and stiff as she tried to pry open the cracked window. But the air outside, even though it was cold, didn't feel right. The night seemed too still, too quiet. "Mark," she whispered, her voice barely audible. She turned toward him, her face pale, eyes wide with fear. "It's locked, and it feels wrong out there." Mark cursed under his breath. They were trapped. Suddenly, a sound echoed through the room, a sharp crackle of static followed by a whisper. It came from the recorder, still running on the nightstand. The microphone had captured their voices earlier, but now it was picking up something else, something distant, something not from this room. Mark moved toward the recorder, his body frozen with apprehension. He picked it up, listening carefully. The whispers were faint at first, but they quickly grew louder. Unintelligible at first, like a garbled radio transmission. But then, distinct words began to form in the static. "Leave. Leave now. You shouldn't have come here." A feeling of dread settled over them like a dark cloud. There was no way out. The room wasn't just a place. It was a trap, and they were already caught. Mark's grip tightened on Eliza's arm as the whispers turned into screams, loud, horrifying screams that reverberated throughout the room. The sound was deafening, but no matter how much they screamed, no one would hear them. The thing on the bed lunged forward, its body twisting and contorting in ways no human body should, its mouth opening wide as it let out a deafening screech that sent Mark and Eliza stumbling back in horror. And then, as quickly as it had started, everything fell silent. Mark and Eliza stood in the center of the room, staring at the empty bed, their hearts racing. The figure was gone, but the fear remained. The silence in room 313 was suffocating. Mark and Eliza stood in the middle of the room, their breaths shallow and quick. The dark, oppressive atmosphere seemed to hang around them like a heavy fog, refusing to let go. It felt as if the very walls were closing in, their cracked paint whispering things they couldn't hear, but felt deep inside their bones. Mark's heart hammered in his chest, and his mind was reeling. What had just happened? Had they really seen that thing? That figure on the bed? Had it been real? Or had they somehow crossed into some otherworldly dimension? "Eliza, are you okay?" He finally managed to say, his voice hoarse. Eliza didn't answer at first. She just stared at the spot where the figure had been, her eyes wide with terror, her lips trembling. Slowly, she shook her head, as if trying to shake off the nightmare she had just witnessed. "I don't know what just happened," she whispered, her voice barely audible. I don't think we're supposed to be here. This place, it's not just haunted. It's something else, something worse." Mark didn't respond. His mind was racing, trying to process everything that had occurred. He grabbed the recorder from a nightstand again, his fingers trembling as he pressed the play button. The static burst through the speakers, followed by that same eerie whisper, the same voice that had spoken to them earlier. "You're too late. You can't leave now." Mark flinched. The voice was clearer now, almost mocking them. He quickly stopped the recording, his thoughts a tangled mess. They were trapped. There was no doubt in his mind about that. But why? Why had they been brought here? And why couldn't they leave? "We need to get out of here," Eliza said suddenly, her voice shaking with fear. "I don't care what we have to do. We need to leave. Now." Mark nodded, the desperation clear in his eyes. He tried the door again, pushing and pulling with all his might. But it was useless. The door wouldn't budge. It was as if something much stronger than them, was holding it shut. Then a strange thought crossed Mark's mind. The window. Without saying a word, he turned toward the window. He didn't care if it was locked. He was going to break it, if he had to. He needed to escape, to get out of this room, before whatever was haunting them could get to them. But as his hand reached for the window, something stopped him. A loud bang came from the direction of the door. Mark froze, his heart skipping a beat. He spun around, his eyes scanning the room frantically. Eliza was already backing away, her face pale, her breathing quick and shallow. Did you hear that?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Mark nodded, his throat dry. The sound had been unmistakable. The door had just slammed, hard, and it hadn't been them. A cold chill swept over the room, sinking deep into their bones. Mark's breath fogged the air in front of him. The temperature had dropped, but it wasn't just cold. It was unnaturally cold, like the very essence of life had been drained from the room. The whispers returned. "It's too late. The story is already written." Mark's heart skipped a beat. The voice sounded almost pleased, satisfied, as if it were watching them struggle, enjoying every second of their terror. "What the hell is happening?" Eliza gasped, her eyes wild with fear. Mark had no answer. He could feel the weight of the room pressing down on them, smothering them. It was like being caught in the eye of a storm, the calm before the chaos, and Mark knew that whatever was going to happen next, it wasn't going to be pretty. Suddenly, the walls seemed to ripple, like the fabric of reality itself was distorting. The air grew heavier, more suffocating, as the lights flickered and dimmed. Mark's head spun, and for a moment, he felt as if the floor beneath him was shifting. The room seemed to tilt just slightly, as if the building itself was warping. "Eliza, we need to leave," Mark shouted, but his voice sounded distant, as if muffled by a thick layer of cotton. He grabbed her arm and pulled her toward the window. He had to get out. They had to get out. But as he reached for the window again, a sudden, violent gust of wind slammed into them, sending both of them sprawling backward. Mark's had collided with the floor, the impact knocking the wind out of him. "Eliza," he gasped, struggling to get to his feet. His vision blurred, his mind fogged. He could feel something pressing down on him, something that wasn't human. It wasn't alive. It was something ancient, something that had been here far longer than they had. Then it came, the low, guttural voice that had haunted them since they stepped foot into the room. "You should have listened. You should have left." The words cut through Mark like a knife. His blood ran cold as he turned to face the source of the voice. The figure on the bed was back, but this time it wasn't lying down. It was standing, slowly, impossibly slow, its limbs creaking as if they hadn't been used in centuries. The thing's face was now fully visible. Its skin was pale, stretched tight over its skull, and its eyes were hollow pits of blackness. Its smile was grotesque, a sickening mockery of joy. And in its hands, it held a piece of paper. Mark's stomach lurched. He could feel it. Something was wrong, something that he couldn't understand, but he knew it had to do with that paper. The figure reached toward him, its movements jerky and unnatural. As it extended its hand, Mark could see the words written on the paper. The letters were twisted, distorted, unreadable. But somehow, Mark could feel them. They burned into his mind, leaving a mark he couldn't erase. "This room will claim you." The words echoed in his mind, repeating over and over, louder and louder until they became a deafening scream. The room seemed to tremble, as if the very building itself was screaming in agony. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the figure vanished, leaving nothing behind but the lingering smell of decay and the faint echo of its voice. "You're part of the story now. There's no going back." Mark's hand shook as he turned to Eliza. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with terror, her body trembling uncontrollably. "We need to leave. Now!" Mark urged, his voice frantic. But the door still wouldn't open. The window still wouldn't budge. They were trapped, and something deep inside Mark's gut told him that if they didn't find a way out soon, they might never leave this room alive. Story 4. The night was cold, the kind of chill that seeped into your bones and refused to let go. The streets were empty, save for the occasional car passing by. But for Thomas, the taxi driver, the loneliness of the city streets was familiar. It was his world, and he had long since grown used to it. His life was a monotonous rhythm: pick up, drop off, repeat. The hum of the engine, the flicker of the streetlights, and the quiet conversations with his passengers were the only things that kept him grounded. But tonight was different. Thomas sat behind the wheel of his yellow cab, the soft glow of the dashboard lights casting a dim hue over his tired face. His eyes were heavy, the weight of the day pressing down on him. It had been a long shift, and he was counting the minutes until he could call a night. The radio crackled, a static hiss filling the otherwise silent cab. He glanced at the time, 2:03 a.m., only a few more hours to go. As he cruised down the quiet streets, his headlights cutting through the darkness, Thomas noticed something strange. A figure standing at the corner of the road, near the bus stop, a woman dressed in a dark coat, her face obscured by the shadows. He slowed the car and pulled up beside her, rolling down the window. "Need a ride?" he asked, his voice hoarse from exhaustion. The woman didn't respond at first. She just stared at him, her eyes hidden beneath the brim of her hat. Thomas could feel an odd chill in the air, something that made the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. It wasn't just the cold. There was something else, something unspoken. Finally, the woman spoke, her voice low and calm. "I need to go to 12th and Oak," she said, but when Thomas glanced at her, she didn't give him an address. Instead, she simply said one name, Samuel. Thomas frowned, his brow furrowing in confusion. "Samuel?" he repeated, unsure if he had heard her correctly. "That's your destination?" The woman nodded slowly, her face still hidden in shadow. "Yes, just Samuel. Take me to him." A cold shiver ran down Thomas's spine. Something about this felt wrong. He had driven thousands of passengers over the years, but he had never encountered one like this. It wasn't unusual for someone to give a name instead of a specific address, but it was unsettling nonetheless. Still, He didn't question it. He had learned long ago not to ask too many questions. It was better that way. All right, I'll take you to Samuel, he said, trying to shake off the uneasy feeling in his gut. The woman climbed into the back seat without another word, and the door slammed shut behind her. As Thomas pulled away from the curb, he couldn't help but glance at her through the rearview mirror. She was sitting perfectly still, her hands folded in her lap, her eyes fixed straight ahead. Her face was hidden in shadow, her features unreadable. The streets were empty, the city silent, as they made their way through the winding roads. Thomas focused on the road ahead, the hum of the engine the only sound in the car. But the silence in the cab was oppressive, making his nerves twitch. He had driven countless late-night fares, but this felt different. There was something about the woman's presence, the way she sat there so still, that unsettled him. They reached the intersection of 12th and Oak, but as Thomas slowed down to make the turn, something strange happened. The woman, without saying a word, reached forward and tapped him on the shoulder. "Stop here," she said. Thomas slammed on the brakes, the tires screeching against the asphalt. He turned to look at her, but when he did, she was gone. The back seat was empty. He froze, his heart racing his chest as he scanned the car, his mind reeling. Where had she gone? He quickly checked the rearview mirror, but there was no sign of her. No shadow, no movement, just an empty back seat. For a moment, Thomas sat there, frozen in disbelief. He glanced around the dark street, but there was no one in sight. No trace of the woman. He couldn't have imagined it. He had seen her. He had spoken to her. But now she was gone. Shaking his head, Thomas let out a deep breath. His pulse was still racing. It had to be a mistake. Maybe she had just slipped out when he wasn't looking, or maybe he was just more tired than he thought. After all, he had been working long hours. His mind was playing tricks on him, but something didn't sit right. The next morning, as Thomas arrived back at the taxi depot, his mind was still spinning. He tried to shake off the feeling of unease, but it lingered. His passengers were always a mystery, always a fleeting moment in his life. But this woman, had been different. Her strange request, the name Samuel, and then her sudden disappearance, they all weighed on him. It wasn't until later that day, as he grabbed a coffee from the diner, that he heard the news. A body had been found in the alley on 12th and Oak. The victim's name was Samuel. The coldness in Thomas's chest returned. He had heard the news on the radio, but hearing it in person felt different, more real. He had just been there, just dropped off that woman at the corner, and now Samuel was dead. Murdered. He tried to push the thought aside, but it gnawed at him. Was there a connection? Was he somehow involved in all of this? As the hours passed, Thomas couldn't escape the feeling that something was terribly wrong. He had seen it on the news, the picture of Samuel's face. It was the same face that had haunted him in the mirror for years, the face that was his own. The world outside had taken on an eerie quality, as though reality itself was slipping through Thomas's fingers. He had always been the kind of man who kept his thoughts to himself, who drove through the night without asking questions. But tonight, everything was different. The face of Samuel, the man found dead at 12th and Oak, was still haunting him. The connection he felt to that name, that face, was undeniable. How could it be a coincidence? How could he have dropped off a woman who had spoken that very name, only to find out the man was murdered just hours later? As he drove through the city streets, the hum of the engine was almost soothing. The familiar rhythm of his late-night ride should have been a comfort, but tonight it felt like an oppressive weight. He couldn't shake the images that kept flashing through his mind. The woman in the back seat, her cryptic request, and her disappearance. The way she had tapped him on the shoulder before vanishing into thin air. His hands gripped the wheel tightly, knuckles white as he fought to keep his mind focused on the road. "Get it together, Thomas," he muttered to himself, his voice hoarse and thick with tension. But it wasn't easy. The unease gnawed at him, refusing to let go. He had to find answers, had to make sense of it all. So he decided to visit the scene. The alley where Samuel had been found was only a few blocks away from a diner. It was a quiet, neglected part of town, the kind of place people avoided after dark. But tonight, it felt like a magnet pulling him closer. Pulling into the alley, Thomas parked his cab and stepped out, the cold night air biting at his skin. The alley was narrow, flanked by abandoned buildings and trash-strewn sidewalks. The faint smell of decay lingered in the air, adding to the sense of desolation. It was the kind of place where people disappeared, unnoticed and forgotten. But tonight, it felt as if the alley was holding on to some dark secret, waiting to be uncovered. Thomas walked slowly down the alley, his footsteps echoing against the walls. As he neared the spot where Samuel's body had been found, he noticed a figure standing by the shadows, another person in the alley. His heart skipped a beat, and he instinctively reached for the wallet in his pocket, his fingers brushing against the cold leather. The figure stepped forward, and Thomas immediately recognized the face. It was the same woman from the taxi ride, the one who had asked to go to 12th and Oak. But how? His breath caught in his throat. He opened his mouth to speak, but before he could say anything, she raised a hand, signaling for him to stay silent. "You're not supposed to be here," she said, her voice calm, but with an edge of urgency that sent a shiver down Thomas's spine. Thomas blinked in confusion. "What do you mean?" He was about to ask her how she had appeared out of nowhere, but the words caught in his throat as she took a step closer. The woman's eyes glinted in the dim light, a coldness that was almost unnatural. "You don't remember, do you?" she asked, her voice now colder, more detached. Thomas's heart pounded in his chest. He took a step back, his mind reeling. The words made no sense. What was she talking about? What was he forgetting? She tilted her head slightly, as though studying him. "You're not here by accident," she whispered. "This has all been planned. You've been part of it all along." "What do you mean? What are you talking about?" Thomas stammered, his voice shaky. She took another step forward, her presence overwhelming. "You've been dead for years, Thomas." The words hit him like a physical blow. He staggered backward, his breath coming in ragged gasps. "Dead?" he repeated, his voice cracking. "No, that's—" But the woman didn't let him finish. She stepped closer, her gaze unwavering. "You've been driving these streets for so long because you never realized what happened. You never knew what was taken from you." Thomas's mind was spinning, his thoughts tumbling over each other like a whirlwind. He was dead? How could that be possible? He could feel his breath, the air filling his lungs. He could feel the coldness of the night on his skin. He could still hear the hum of his taxi, the world around him still moving. But she was telling him something that felt wrong, something that didn't make sense. "You're lying," he said, shaking his head, trying to convince himself more than her. The woman's face softened, but only for a moment. Then her eyes hardened again, and she pointed toward the alleyway ahead. "Go to the end of the alley. There's something you need to see." Thomas didn't want to follow her. Every instinct told him to turn around and run, to leave this place before whatever madness she was speaking took hold of him. But something inside him, some deep, primal need to understand, compelled him to move forward. He had to know the truth. He had to find out what was really happening. Against his better judgment, Thomas took a step toward the end of the alley. The woman watched him silently, her expression unreadable. As he neared the end of the alley, he saw it. At first, he couldn't make sense of what he was looking at, but as he stepped closer, the realization hit him with a gut-wrenching shock. Lying on the ground, just beneath the dim light of a flickering street lamp, was a small, blood-stained piece of fabric. It was unmistakably familiar. The same fabric that lined the seat of his own taxi. It was from the cab's upholstery. Thomas staggered back, his mind racing. He had seen that fabric before. He had sat on it countless times during his shifts. But why was it here? Why was it in this alley, stained with blood? His heart sank as the woman's voice broke through the fog in his mind. "The blood is not Samuel's. It's yours." A cold sweat broke out across Thomas's forehead. He reached down to touch the fabric, his hand trembling uncontrollably. His fingers brushed against the material, and in that instant, everything clicked into place. This wasn't just a simple murder case. This was something far darker, something far more sinister, and it was all tied to him. Thomas's mind raced as he stood there, frozen by the realization that the blood-stained fabric was from his own cab. His fingers trembled as he let go of the cloth, the reality of what the woman had said sinking in slowly, like a creeping chill in the air. The blood wasn't Samuel's, it was his own, and somehow that meant everything he knew about his life was a lie. He staggered back, gasping for breath, trying to force the overwhelming tide of panic back into the recesses of his mind. But it wasn't working. The pieces didn't fit. How could he be dead? How could he be driving for all these years if he wasn't alive? The woman's words echoed in his head. Relentless. You've been dead for years, Thomas. Dead. The thought kept repeating, each repetition like a nail in his coffin. It didn't make sense. He was here. He could feel his chest rising and falling with every breath. He could feel his heart pounding, could hear the faint rustle of his clothing, the cool night air pressing against his skin. He wasn't dead. He couldn't be. But the evidence was undeniable. The blood on the fabric, the fact that he had no memory of his life before driving the taxi. Every night, every ride felt like it blurred into the next. Faces became indistinguishable. Stories were lost in the static of his life. He had no past, no family, no history. Just endless rides in a cab that never seemed to stop. Why am I still here? Thomas muttered to himself, as if saying the words out loud might make them more real, might make him understand. The woman remained silent, her cold eyes watching him from the shadows. She hadn't moved, but her presence loomed like a dark cloud, hovering just at the edge of his awareness. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, she spoke again, her voice carrying a quiet, almost sorrowful tone. You were the first, she said, the first to be taken, and you've been driving ever since. Thomas turned to face her, the shock and confusion still etched on his features. The first? Taken? What are you talking about? Her gaze softened for a brief moment, but then the coldness returned. The night you died, Thomas. It was the start of all this, the start of this endless ride. What happened that night? Thomas's voice cracked, desperate for the truth, no matter how horrifying it might be. The woman took a step closer, her step soft and deliberate. It was a car accident, she said quietly. You were hit on the highway, struck by a speeding car that swerved off the road. You died instantly, or so they thought. Thomas's heart dropped into his stomach. A car accident? That sounded too ordinary to explain the strangeness of his existence. But she wasn't finished. You didn't truly die, Thomas, she continued. Your soul didn't leave this world. You were trapped between life and death. And now, you've been forced to drive this cab, picking up passengers who died because of you. The words hit him like a punch in the gut. He felt his knees weaken, as if the ground beneath him was no longer solid. Trapped, forced. Was this what he had been doing all these years? Was he some sort of unwilling accomplice in the deaths of those passengers? The thought was unbearable. No, Thomas whispered, shaking his head. No, I didn't. The woman stepped forward, her eyes locked onto his. You didn't realize it, but every ride you take, every passenger you pick up, is a part of the curse that binds you. They get in, and they never make it out. And you have no memory of it. You drop them off, and they vanish, but they die shortly after. And you have no recollection, no awareness of it. Thomas felt the weight of her words pressing down on him. He wanted to scream, to deny everything, but something deep within him told him it was true. There had to be a reason why he never remembered the faces of his passengers. There had to be a reason why the streets felt so endless, so unchanging. He had been trapped in this loop for as long as he could remember. He fell to his knees, his mind reeling, overwhelmed by the terror of it all. How do I stop it? He choked out. How do I end this? How do I get out of this nightmare? The woman didn't answer immediately. She just stood there, her figure illuminated by the faint light filtering through the alleyway. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, she spoke again, her voice now colder than ever. You can't stop it, she said simply. Thomas's eyes snapped up to meet hers, a sense of dread washing over him. What do you mean I can't stop it? You're already dead, Thomas, she replied, her voice cutting through the air like a sharp knife. You can't escape something that doesn't exist. You're a ghost, living in a world that doesn't want you. This is your punishment, your endless ride, and there's no way out. The finality of her words hit him with the force of a freight train. His chest tightened as the reality of what she was saying sank in. He was dead. He had been for years. And this endless driving, this endless picking up of passengers, was all there was. There was no escape, no release, just this. Tears welled up in his eyes as the enormity of it all threatened to consume him. He had been stuck in this cycle, haunted by faces he couldn't remember, cursed to drive a cab that never stopped moving, always taking people to their deaths. And now, the truth was too much to bear. The woman watched him with cold attachment, as if she had seen this before, as if this was the fate of all the lost souls who wandered the earth without realizing they had already crossed over. What about the others? Thomas asked, his voice barely a whisper. What about the passengers? Do they know? She shook her head. They don't remember either. They never do. They're just like you, trapped in the loop, unaware that their time has run out. They're the ones who disappear, just like you did. They're part of the curse too. Thomas felt his head spin. He didn't know how much more he could take. But before he could say anything else, the woman turned and began to walk away, disappearing into the shadows of the alley. You're not alone, Thomas, she called back, her voice echoing off the walls. We're all trapped here together. The sound of her footsteps faded into the night, leaving Thomas alone in the alley, his heart heavy with the burden of his cursed existence. He wanted to scream, to break free, but there was nowhere to run. The streets stretched on forever, the hum of the engine never stopping. He was still driving, still picking up passengers, still living a life that wasn't his own. And as the night deepened around him, Thomas understood that there would be no dawn for him. Not anymore. Story 5. The small town of Riverton had always been quiet, tucked away in a forgotten corner of the world where time seemed to stand still. Its main street was lined with crumbling brick buildings, faded signs advertising businesses that had long since closed, and the occasional rusted-out car parked on the side. But for all the decay and dust that clung to the town, there was one place that had remained untouched, a constant fixture in the heart of Riverton, the Stenson Funeral Home. For over 50 years, the funeral home had been a cornerstone of the community. It had always been there, a somber, brick structure standing stoically at the end of Main Street. Everyone knew Charles Stenson, the mortician. He was a quiet man with sharp features, a thin mustache, and a penchant for wearing black suits even when it wasn't necessary. He was an enigma, never married, never seen outside his work, and always present during the most difficult times in the lives of the townspeople. His funeral home had become more than just a place of mourning. It had become a strange, almost sacred part of the town's routine. No one questioned it. But on one cold autumn night, everything changed. The fire started just after midnight, a flickering orange light, casting an eerie glow over the town. At first, it seemed like just another small blaze, a burning pile of leaves or a stray ember from one of the nearby homes. But within minutes, the fire grew. The flames leaped higher, devouring the old brick walls and filling the air with thick, black smoke. The town's sleepy silence was shattered by the wail of sirens as firefighters rushed to the scene, but it was already too late. The fire raged, unstoppable and unforgiving, reducing the funeral home to a smoldering heap of charred wood and ash. The next morning, as the sun rose over the ruined building, the townspeople gathered at the site. A small crowd stood, murmuring quietly, staring at the wreckage. The fire had left nothing but a skeleton of burnt-out beams and broken windows. The acrid smell of burnt was still lingering in the air. And in the center of it all, Charles Stenson was nowhere to be found. At first, there was no sign of foul play. The fire seemed to have been an accident, the result of faulty wiring or an unattended candle. But as investigators combed through the wreckage, they discovered something horrifying. In the basement of the funeral home, amid the ruins of old embalming tools and medical equipment, They found something that would change everything. Hundreds of bodies, some old, some freshly preserved, stacked one on top of the other like discarded objects. But the most disturbing part of the discovery was that none of them had ever been buried. None of them had been returned to their families. The morgue shelves were lined with remains that were supposed to have been sent to their final resting places years ago, but had never left the basement. And as the investigators dug deeper, they uncovered more, hidden in dark corners and behind false walls. There was no rhyme or reason to the arrangement. It was as if Charles Stenson had simply kept the bodies, each one more decayed than the last, hidden from a world. But the real horror lay in the condition of the bodies themselves. Some had been expertly embalmed, their features preserved with such precision that they appeared almost lifelike. But others were not. They had been cut open, their organs removed, and their bodies rearranged in grotesque ways. Some had their limbs repositioned. Others had their eyes sewn shut, their mouths stitched into permanent smiles. And the worst part was that they weren't just lifeless corpses. They had been experimented on. It wasn't just embalming. It was as if Stenson had been obsessed with keeping them alive, or at least preserving them in a way that defied nature. He had gone beyond the simple art of preservation. These bodies were not meant for burial. They were meant to be kept, to be studied, to be cheated of death. The authorities were stunned. How had this man managed to keep so many bodies hidden for so long? How had no one ever noticed that the people who had passed away years ago had never been laid to rest? No one could answer that. Not yet. But one thing was clear. Charles Stenson was not the man the town had believed him to be. And then came the real question that hung in the air like a dark cloud. Why? Why had he done this? Why had he kept these bodies? What kind of twisted obsession had driven him to defy nature and tamper with the dead? Was this just a man's misguided attempt at immortality? Or had there been something more sinister at play? As the investigators delved further into the case, they discovered that Charles Stenson had never been content with simply embalming the dead. His obsession with death, and with preventing it, had consumed him for decades. He had spent years researching ways to preserve bodies for eternity. He had scoured medical journals, consulted with obscure specialists, and even experimented on animals in an attempt to find a way to stop death in its tracks. And with each new body that came to his funeral home, he had experimented further, attempting to create a perfect, deathless specimen. Some of the bodies were preserved perfectly, their skin as smooth as porcelain, their eyes wide open as though frozen in the moment of their death. Others were far more grotesque, limbs twisted, bodies hacked apart, and organs replaced with unnatural materials in a desperate attempt to create the illusion of eternal life. But despite his efforts, Stenson never succeeded. The bodies remained dead, but they remained preserved in ways that science could not explain. And as the years passed, his obsession grew deeper, darker, more dangerous. The town of Riverton had always been a place of quiet peace, a place where death was just another part of life, a sad, inevitable reality. But now, as the ashes of the funeral home settled on the ground, it became clear that the man they had trusted with their loved ones had been hiding something far more sinister in the depths of his mortuary. And what the investigators would soon learn was that the true horror had only just begun. For Charles Stenson had never truly let go of the dead. He had merely been waiting. The discovery of Charles Stenson's macabre collection sent shockwaves through the small town of Riverton. News of the bodies found in the funeral home's basement spread like wildfire. No one could understand how the town's most trusted figure, someone who prepared the dead for their final journeys, could have been hiding such a dark, twisted secret. The funeral home had always been a place where grief was respected, where the dead were laid to rest with dignity. But now, it seemed that all of that had been a lie. The authorities were in overdrive. The coroner's office had been inundated with bodies that had to be identified. The investigation into the mortician's grisly experiments began immediately, but no one could figure out where Charles Stenson had gone. He had vanished the night of the fire, leaving no trace, as though he had disappeared into thin air. The police scoured the town, questioning anyone who might have seen him. They searched his home. They interviewed the few townsfolk who had known him well, but no one had anything concrete to offer. Stenson was a man of routine, a man who kept to himself. He didn't have close friends. He didn't have family. The townspeople thought they knew him, but now, as they dug deeper, they realized how little they had truly understood about the man who had spent decades preparing their dead. Then, one afternoon, a breakthrough came. An old file buried deep within the town's archives was found by a junior detective named Tim Whitaker. The file was thin, almost forgotten, with only a handful of papers inside. It was a record of an investigation that had occurred 25 years ago, involving a series of disappearances. The names of the missing were familiar, people who had been part of the town's history, yet their disappearances had never been fully explained. It was one of those cases that had been quietly swept under the rug, a matter that was too inconvenient to pursue. Among the names listed in the file was Charles Stenson's. The file contained a brief, vague report. It stated that, years ago, a few of the town's citizens had gone missing, always elderly or sick individuals, always people who had visited the funeral home to arrange for their final rites. The missing persons were not presumed dead at first. After all, it was unusual for older folks to leave town in their final days, to go off to live with family or seek treatment elsewhere. But there was something about these disappearances that raised a few suspicions. People had started to notice a strange pattern. Charles Stenson had been interviewed during the investigation. He had been questioned about his role in the community and whether he had any knowledge of the disappearances. His answers had been so matter-of-fact, so unremarkable, that the investigators had dropped the case. Stenson had seemed like nothing more than a quiet, eccentric man who had devoted himself to his work. There was nothing suspicious about him at the time. But now, looking at the file with the benefit of hindsight, Detective Whitaker saw the clues that no one had noticed before. The same name appeared again and again in the report: Avery Carson. Avery Carson had been a prominent local figure, an old man who had owned the town's general store. Carson had been a pillar of the community for decades, known by everyone and respected by all. But one evening, he had gone missing after visiting the funeral home. No one had seen him leave, and no one had heard from him again. He had simply vanished. The case had gone cold. But now, Whitaker realized something chilling. Carson had been one of Stenson's first patients, a man who had come to the funeral home to prepare his own arrangements. The dots were starting to connect. Whitaker couldn't shake the feeling that Stenson had been involved in more than just the deaths he had embalmed. Could it be that Stenson had been part of a much larger, more horrifying pattern of murder? Could he have been killing these people, preserving them for some twisted, godlike reason? He had to find out. As the investigation continued, more disturbing discoveries were made. They uncovered photographs hidden within Stenson's personal files, pictures of dead bodies that had been taken long before the fire. These were not just random pictures. They were close-ups of the embalmed bodies, each one showing a different experiment. In some images, the bodies have been altered in strange ways. Eyes have been replaced with glass spheres, veins have been injected with unknown chemicals, and in some cases, the skin was stretched unnaturally, as though Stenson had tried to preserve the bodies in a state of eternal youth. But it wasn't just the photographs that haunted Whitaker. As he combed through Stenson's personal belongings, he found something that shook him to the core. A journal, a small leather-bound book, worn at the edges. It was filled with Stenson's handwriting, his thoughts, his ideas, his experiments. The entries were cryptic and rambling, but one stood out. The key to immortality is in the preservation of the soul, not the body. Once I learn to preserve the soul, I will not need to die. The body is just a vessel. It was a chilling admission, one that painted Stenson as more than just a mortician. He wasn't interested in embalming the dead. He had been obsessed with cheating death itself. But how? How could he possibly think such a thing? Was it even possible to preserve a soul? Whitaker was beginning to understand that Stenson's obsession went far beyond the macabre act of embalming. This was a man who believed that by preserving the bodies in a specific unnatural way, he could hold on to life itself. But it had gone horribly wrong. The bodies weren't merely preserved. They were changed in ways that could never be explained. And there was one last entry in the journal that made Whitaker's blood run cold. I can feel them in the walls. They are waking up. They will never leave me. Whitaker's mind raced. Who was Stenson talking about? The bodies? Or something else entirely? In the quiet of the police station, surrounded by the dark and unsettling revelations of Stenson's past, the investigation took a terrifying turn. Whitaker now realized that they weren't just chasing a man who had defied death. He had invited something else into the town, something that had been waiting all along. Detective Tim Whitaker had never been one to give in to fear, but as the investigation into Charles Stenson's gruesome experiments deepened, an unsettling chill crept over him. The more he uncovered, the more it became clear that Stenson's actions were far beyond the realm of what any rational person could understand. The man had been obsessed, not with death itself, but with the preservation of life. And now, it seemed that this obsession had triggered something unnatural. After his discovery of the journal, Whitaker couldn't shake the eerie feeling that something had been awoken, something tied to the hundreds of bodies Stenson had embalmed over the years. The town of Riverton had always been quiet, its people simple, its traditions rooted in the past. But now, it felt as though something malevolent had infiltrated every corner of the town, a dark presence lurking just beneath the surface. As Whitaker pieced together the evidence, he grew more certain that Stenson had done more than just preserve bodies. He had altered them, infused them with something else. The idea of preserving the soul, a notion so foreign to modern science, had become an obsession for Stenson. But it wasn't just about preserving the soul, it was about controlling it. By embalming the bodies in a way that defied natural laws, Stenson had tapped into something far darker. Whitaker's first clue came when he revisited the site of fire, the remains of the funeral home. The charred remains of Stenson's home had been reduced to rubble, but the investigators had managed to recover a handful of items. Amidst the ashes, they found one final, disturbing piece of evidence, an old medical device, unlike anything they'd seen before. It was a strange contraption, half machine, half organic, with intricate symbols carved into its surface. The device seemed to hum with a faint energy, as though it had a life of its own. When Whitaker examined it closer, he felt the hairs on the back of his neck stand on end. It wasn't just an embalming tool. This was something more, something that could have only been created by a mind consumed by madness. He took the device back to the station for further examination, where it was promptly declared an enigma. No one could identify what it was or what it had been used for. But one thing was clear. This wasn't just a tool for preserving the dead. It was a conduit, a bridge between life and death, a way for Stenson to have reached into the very essence of human existence. As the investigation progressed, more and more people began to report strange occurrences around town. Pets had gone missing. Strange sounds echoed in the night, and people who had visited the funeral home years ago spoke of unsettling dreams in which they were trapped in endless corridors, unable to escape, surrounded by shadows of the dead. But it wasn't just the supernatural occurrences that haunted Whitaker. There were other things that he couldn't explain. Late one evening, as he was alone in his office reviewing Stenson's files, he received an unexpected visitor. The man was tall and gaunt, his face pale, with dark circles under his eyes. He appeared suddenly, standing in the doorway of the police station with no warning. His name was Charles Stenson's former apprentice, a man named Lucas Finch. Lucas had been a quiet, unassuming young man, one of the few who had worked with Stenson during his time at the funeral home. He had disappeared the night of the fire, and no one had heard from him since. Now here he was, standing in front of Whitaker, looking as though he had aged years in just a few days. "Detective Whitaker," Lucas said, his voice trembling, "I know what's happened. I know what Stenson was trying to do." Whitaker studied him carefully. "You were working with Stenson at the funeral home?" Lucas nodded, but his eyes darted nervously around the room, as if he expected someone or something to be lurking just beyond his vision. "I was the one who helped him with the embalming," Lucas continued, his voice low. "I didn't understand it at first, but as time went on, I saw the changes in the bodies. They didn't decay the way they should have. They didn't decompose. And Stenson, he was obsessed. He kept talking about preserving the soul, about cheating death. He said it was the only way to achieve immortality." Whitaker's heart pounded. "What do you mean? You're saying he was experimenting on the bodies? But why?" Lucas took a deep breath, his hands shaking. "Because he believed that if he could preserve the bodies long enough, if he could freeze time, somehow he could keep the souls trapped inside. He believed that by preserving the body in an unnatural state, he could stop death. But it wasn't just about the body. It was the soul he was after. He thought that by doing this, he could make the soul eternal. Whitaker's mind raced. And what happened to the people whose bodies he experimented on? The ones he preserved? Lucas swallowed hard. They didn't just stay dead. I don't know how, but they came back. Not in the way you think. They didn't wake up. They were changed. Their bodies were still dead, but their souls, they were trapped in the walls of the funeral home. Stenson was torturing them, in a way. He was using their souls to fuel his experiments. And now, something's happened. The walls, the floor, the basement, everything's alive. The bodies, the souls, they're awakening. Whitaker felt his stomach drop. What are you talking about? Are you telling me the souls of the dead are still in Riverton? Lucas nodded grimly. Yes, and they're getting stronger. They're starting to feed on the living. The air in the room grew thick, oppressive. Whitaker could feel a cold draft sweeping through the station, the hairs on his neck standing on end. Something was wrong, something far beyond the realm of human understanding. Lucas turned toward the door, his eyes wide with fear. You have to stop them. You have to stop the souls from escaping. If they break free, there's no telling what will happen. Whitaker grabbed Lucas by the arm. Wait, what do you mean? What's going to happen? Lucas looked at him, his face pale and twisted in terror. They'll take everything. The town, the people, and then they'll take you. With that, Lucas stumbled back, his eyes filled with a primal fear. He bolted from the station, disappearing into the night. Whitaker stood frozen, his mind spinning with the terrifying implications of what Lucas had said. The souls were awake. They were coming, and no one was safe. Story 6. When Eric Ross purchased a house on Willow Creek Road, he thought he had finally found the perfect place to start fresh. A secluded, 2-story cottage on the outskirts of town, with tall trees that whispered in the wind, and a view of the creek that ran just behind the property. It was everything he had dreamed of, peaceful, quiet, away from the bustle of the city. But as he stood in front of the house, keys in hand, an unsettling feeling stirred within him. It wasn't the kind of fear you might expect from an old, haunted house, but something subtler, something he couldn't quite place. The previous owners had left in a hurry, the house so far below market value. There was talk of fire years ago, something about a tragic incident in the town. But Eric hadn't paid much attention to the details. He was just happy to be away from the noise and chaos of his old life. No more distractions, no more stress. At first, everything seemed perfect. The house had a charm about it, even though it was in need of some repairs. The walls creaked with age, the floors groaned beneath his feet, but these were the sounds of a home settling, he told himself. Nothing out of the ordinary. It wasn't until the third night that the whispering began. It started faintly, like the rustle of leaves, barely audible over the hum of the old refrigerator. Eric had been sitting in his living room, reading a book in the dim light of a table lamp, when he first heard it. A soft, almost imperceptible sound, like a child's voice murmuring through the walls. Help us, it whispered, so faint that Eric thought he might have imagined it. He froze, straining his ears to listen, but the sound was gone. The house was old, after all. It could have been the settling of pipes or a draft from one of the windows. He shrugged it off, returning to his book. But as the days passed, the whispers grew louder, clearer. They came in the dead of night, echoing through the walls like whispers of a forgotten past. At first, Eric tried to convince himself it was nothing. Maybe it was just a house. Old houses made noises. But every night, without fail, the whispers returned. And they were not just random sounds. They had a rhythm, a pattern. It was as though they were trying to tell him something. One night, after a particularly unnerving whisper, Eric decided he had had enough. He would get to the bottom of it. He stood up from his chair and followed the sound, walking through the narrow hallway, his heart pounding in his chest. The whispers seemed to be coming from behind the walls of the living room, just beyond the faded wallpaper. He pressed his ear against the wall, listening intently. It was then that he heard the words, unmistakably clear this time. Help us. Find him. He's still here. A chill ran down Eric's spine. He pulled away from the wall, his breath coming in shallow gasps. He stepped back into the living room, the shadows of the old house stretching out before him. It was then that he noticed something he hadn't before, something that seemed out of place. In the corner of the room, partially hidden by a large, ancient-looking bookshelf, was a small door. It was barely noticeable, almost as if it had been deliberately concealed. Eric's curiosity piqued. He approached the door, crouching down to get a better look. The door was old, wooden, and sealed shut with thick nails and a layer of cement. His fingers traced the edges of the doorframe, feeling the rough texture of the dried cement. This wasn't something he had noticed when he first moved in. This door had been hidden intentionally. His mind raced. What could be behind it? And why had it been sealed off so tightly? The whispers returned, more urgent now. "Please, you have to find him. We can't rest." Eric's heart hammered in his chest. He ran his hand over the surface of cement, his mind spinning with possibilities. The house had been abandoned for years. The previous owners had left abruptly, and the rumors about the fire had always been vague. He knew there was a dark history here, but this felt different. It felt personal. Without thinking, Eric pulled the old crowbar from the toolbox he'd left in the corner of the room and wedged it between the wood and cement. With a grunt, he pried at the door, the nails screeching as they were ripped from the wood. His muscles strained as he worked, the whispers growing louder with each passing second, more insistent. "Find him, please." Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the last nail came loose. Eric pushed the door open, revealing a narrow, dusty crawl space. The air was stale, the floor littered with broken glass and forgotten debris. But it wasn't the state of the crawl space that made Eric's stomach turn. It was what he saw inside. A pile of old furniture was stacked in one corner, some pieces still draped in faded sheets, others shattered into pieces. But what caught his eye was a thick layer of dust and grime covering everything. This space had been untouched for years, perhaps even decades. It seemed to be a forgotten part of the house, a place where no one dared to go. And then, just beyond the clutter, he saw something that made his blood run cold. A small, yellowed piece of paper, barely visible beneath the layers of dust, fluttered in the dim light. Eric's heart skipped a beat as he reached forward, his hands trembling as he picked it up. The paper was brittle and torn, but there was something written on it. 5 children. Missing. Never found. Eric's eyes widened. The paper felt like a weight in his hands. The words etched into his mind. The whispers continued, more urgent than ever, echoing through the crawl space. "Help us. Find the man. He's still here." The words seemed to come from all around him, as if the very walls of the house were alive with the voices of the lost children. Eric felt a cold sweat break out on his forehead. The piece of paper was more than just a clue. It was a warning that someone had been here before him, someone who had known the dark history of this house. The whispers were no longer a mystery. They were a plea for help, and Eric knew, deep in his gut, that he had stumbled upon something far darker than he could have ever imagined. The house was not just haunted by the memories of a fire. It was haunted by the souls of the children who had never found peace. And the whispers weren't just voices from the past. They were trying to guide him to something, to someone who was still alive, someone who was watching him. Eric took a deep breath, the weight of the revelation settling over him. He wasn't just a man with a strange house. He was part of something much bigger, something far more sinister. And the voices would not let him go until the truth was uncovered. The sound of the whispers didn't stop after Eric found the paper. If anything, it grew louder, more urgent, as though they had been waiting for him to discover their secret. They weren't just sounds anymore. They were becoming his obsession. Every step he took, every creak of the floorboards, every rustle of wind to the trees outside seemed to carry the faintest trace of those whispered voices, guiding him, urging him forward. Eric couldn't shake the feeling that the house itself had a presence, a consciousness of sorts. The walls seemed to pulse with every breath he took, and the air felt heavier, as though it carried the weight of all the lives that had come before him. But what unsettled him the most was the relentless sense that something, was watching him, following his every movement. That night, he could barely sleep. The whispers had invaded his thoughts, playing over and over in his mind, the phrase "find him" repeating like a broken record. The wind howled outside, rattling the windows, but all Eric could focus on was the crawl space door. What had he uncovered? Who were these children? And why had their fate been sealed in this house? As the darkness of night deepened, Eric made a decision. He needed to investigate further. He couldn't let this mystery consume him, not without answers. But first, he had to go to the local library, find out everything he could about the fire, the children, and the history of the house. There was something he needed to know, something he hadn't uncovered yet. The next morning, after a restless night filled with fragmented dreams of children's laughter and screams, Eric headed into town. The library was an old, quiet building nestled between two coffee shops. The scent of musty paper and wood greeted him as he stepped inside, the doors creaking behind him. A solitary librarian sat at the desk, her head bent over a stack of books, glasses perched on the end of her nose. Eric approached the desk and cleared his throat, trying to steady his nerves. He had no idea how to start the conversation. "Hi," he said, his voice faltering a little. "I'm looking for information about a fire that happened in Willow Creek about 30 years ago, I think. It was in a foster home, a place for children." The librarian looked up, her eyes sharp and knowing. "Ah, you mean the foster house fire," she said, her voice low. "The one that took so many lives. That was a tragic day, Mr. Ross. You're not the first to come asking about it." Eric frowned. "The foster house fire?" he repeated. "I didn't know it had a name." The librarian nodded slowly. "It was well known in these parts. 5 children were killed in that fire. And though the investigation was thorough, no one ever found the cause. The house was burned to ground, but there was no clear reason for the blaze. It was all very mysterious. It's been decades now, but some people still say the children's spirits linger, and some believe the fire wasn't an accident at all." Eric leaned forward, a chill creeping up his spine. "Do you have any more details? Anything that could explain why those children were there, or who might have been responsible?" The librarian's face darkened. "There's a file, but it's not one most people care to look at. A lot of people in town prefer to forget what happened. They say it's better not to ask questions. But if you're determined, I'll show you." A chill ran down Eric's spine. He pulled away from the wall, his breath coming in shallow gasps. He stepped back into the living room, the shadows of the old house stretching out before him. It was then that he noticed something he hadn't before, something that seemed out of place. In the corner of the room, partially hidden by a large, ancient-looking bookshelf, was a small door. It was barely noticeable, almost as if it had been deliberately concealed. Eric's curiosity piqued. He approached the door, crouching down to get a better look. The door was old, wooden, and sealed shut with thick nails and a layer of cement. His fingers traced the edges of the doorframe, feeling the rough texture of the dried cement. This wasn't something he had noticed when he first moved in. This door had been hidden intentionally. His mind raced. What could be behind it? And why had it been sealed off so tightly? The whispers returned, more urgent now. "Please, you have to find him. We can't rest." Eric's heart hammered in his chest. He ran his hand over the surface of cement, his mind spinning with possibilities. The house had been abandoned for years. The previous owners had left abruptly, and the rumors about the fire had always been vague. He knew there was a dark history here, but this felt different. It felt personal. Without thinking, Eric pulled the old crowbar from the toolbox he'd left in the corner of the room and wedged it between the wood and cement. With a grunt, he pried at the door, the nails screeching as they were ripped from the wood. His muscles strained as he worked, the whispers growing louder with each passing second, more insistent. "Find him, please." Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the last nail came loose. Eric pushed the door open, revealing a narrow, dusty crawl space. The air was stale, the floor littered with broken glass and forgotten debris. But it wasn't the state of the crawl space that made Eric's stomach turn. It was what he saw inside. A pile of old furniture was stacked in one corner, some pieces still draped in faded sheets, others shattered into pieces. But what caught his eye was a thick layer of dust and grime covering everything. This space had been untouched for years, perhaps even decades. It seemed to be a forgotten part of the house, a place where no one dared to go. And then, just beyond the clutter, he saw something that made his blood run cold. A small, yellowed piece of paper, barely visible beneath the layers of dust, fluttered in the dim light. Eric's heart skipped a beat as he reached forward, his hands trembling as he picked it up. The paper was brittle and torn, but there was something written on it. 5 children. Missing. Never found. Eric's eyes widened. The paper felt like a weight in his hands. The words etched into his mind. The whispers continued, more urgent than ever, echoing through the crawl space. Help us. Find the man. He's still here. The words seemed to come from all around him, as if the very walls of the house were alive with the voices of the lost children. Eric felt a cold sweat break out on his forehead. The piece of paper was more than just a clue. It was a warning that someone had been here before him, someone who had known the dark history of this house. The whispers were no longer a mystery. They were a plea for help, and Eric knew, deep in his gut, that he had stumbled upon something far darker than he could have ever imagined. The house was not just haunted by the memories of a fire. It was haunted by the souls of the children who had never found peace. And the whispers weren't just voices from the past. They were trying to guide him to something, to someone who was still alive, someone who was watching him. Eric took a deep breath, the weight of the revelation settling over him. He wasn't just a man with a strange house. He was part of something much bigger, something far more sinister. And the voices would not let him go until the truth was uncovered. The sound of the whispers didn't stop after Eric found the paper. If anything, it grew louder, more urgent, as though they had been waiting for him to discover their secret. They weren't just sounds anymore. They were becoming his obsession. Every step he took, every creak of the floorboards, every rustle of wind to the trees outside seemed to carry the faintest trace of those whisper voices, guiding him, urging him forward. Eric couldn't shake the feeling that the house itself had a presence, a consciousness of sorts. The walls seemed to pulse with every breath he took, and the air felt heavier, as though it carried the weight of all the lives that had come before him. But what unsettled him the most was the relentless sense that something, was watching him, following his every movement. That night, he could barely sleep. The whispers had invaded his thoughts, playing over and over in his mind. The phrase "find him" repeating like a broken record. The wind howled outside, rattling the windows, but all Eric could focus on was the crawlspace door. What had he uncovered? Who were these children, and why had their fate been sealed in this house? As the darkness of night deepened, Eric made a decision. He needed to investigate further. He couldn't let this mystery consume him, not without answers. But first, he had to go to the local library, find out everything he could about the fire, the children, and the history of the house. There was something he needed to know, something he hadn't uncovered yet. The next morning, after a restless night filled with fragmented dreams of children's laughter and screams, Eric headed into town. The library was an old, quiet building nestled between 2 coffee shops. The scent of musty paper and what greeted him as he stepped inside, the doors creaking behind him. A solitary librarian sat at the desk, her head bent over a stack of books, glasses perched on the end of her nose. Eric approached the desk and cleared his throat, trying to steady his nerves. He had no idea how to start the conversation. "Hi," he said, his voice faltering a little. "I'm looking for information about a fire that happened in Willow Creek about 30 years ago, I think. It was in a foster home, a place for children." The librarian looked up, her eyes sharp and knowing. "Ah, you mean the foster house fire," she said, her voice low. "The one that took so many lives. That was a tragic day, Mr. Ross. You're not the first to come asking about it." Eric frowned. "The foster house fire?" he repeated. "I didn't know it had a name." The librarian nodded slowly. "It was well known in these parts. 5 children were killed in that fire. And though the investigation was thorough, no one ever found the cause. The house was burned to ground, but there was no clear reason for the blaze. It was all very mysterious. It's been decades now, but some people still say the children's spirits linger, and some believe the fire wasn't an accident at all." Eric leaned forward, a chill creeping up his spine. "Do you have any more details? Anything that could explain why those children were there, or who might have been responsible?" The librarian's face darkened. "There's a file, but it's not one most people care to look at. A lot of people in town prefer to forget what happened. They say it's better not to ask questions. But if you're determined, I'll show you." She led him to a back room filled with dusty shelves, and after a few moments of rummaging through old records, she pulled out a thick manila folder. She handed it to him with a look of caution in her eyes. "Be careful with this," she said, her voice low. "Some things are best left undisturbed." Eric nodded, taking the file, his mind racing with questions. As soon as he sat down at a table and began flipping through the pages, a sense of dread settled over him. The details were sparse, but the more he read, the more the events started to paint a horrifying picture. The fire had started on a winter night, in the early hours of the morning. The foster home had been home to several children, most of whom had been abandoned or orphaned. But what struck Eric most were the names of the children. 5 young lives lost, 5 innocents who had never been found. Their names were familiar to him now, each one written on a faded page in black ink. Sarah, Jamie, Peter, Emma, and little Olivia. The documents mentioned a few investigations, but nothing conclusive ever came of them. No arsonist had been caught. No foul play had been found. But the most chilling part of the file was a mention of a witness, a man who had been at the scene that night, a man who had claimed to have seen a figure standing near the house just before the fire began. The man had been a local handyman, but when investigators tried to track him down, he had vanished, as if he had never existed. Eric's hands trembled as he read the last few lines of the report. The witness's description had been vague, but was enough to send a shiver down his spine. A man with dark eyes, a shadowy figure who had seemed to blend into the night, a man who had been too close to the fire to escape. And then there was a final note that made Eric's blood run cold. Some believe the man who started the fire is still alive, living in the town, watching. A cold wave of realization washed over Eric. He wasn't just dealing with ghosts. He was dealing with a living killer. The whispers had been right. The children weren't just asking for help. They were trying to guide him to someone who had never been caught. And now, Eric knew he wasn't just a witness to their torment. He was the next one on the list. As he sat there in the dim library, a quiet unease settled over him. The voices were growing louder in his mind, demanding that he find a man who had done this. They were speaking to him now, no longer in whispers, but in urgent, pleading cries. "Find him, he's still here." Suddenly, the silence of the room was broken by a faint sound, a sound from behind him. Eric turned quickly, his heart racing, but there was no one there. No one except the librarian, who was now staring at him with a knowing look, her eyes wide and fixed. "I knew you would come," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Eric froze, the file still clutched in his hands. The room felt colder now, the air thick with tension. The librarian's expression was unreadable, but there was something else in her eyes, a shadow of fear, as if she had seen this story play out before. "Who are you?" Eric asked, his voice barely a whisper. But the librarian didn't answer. She simply stood up, turning away, her footsteps echoing as she moved toward the door. "You're in too deep now, Eric," she called over her shoulder, her voice carrying a weight of warning. "You can't stop it. The past never forgets." And with that, she was gone. Eric's hand shook as he left the library, the file still clutched tightly in his grip. The librarian's words echoed in his mind. The past never forgets. What did she mean? Who was she really? He felt a deep sense of unease, as if every step he took was being watched by unseen eyes. The silence of town around him seemed oppressive now, as though the streets themselves were holding their breath, waiting for something. By the time Eric returned to the house, the sun had set. The shadows stretched long across the property, casting everything in an eerie, unsettling light. He stood at the front door for a moment, his hand hovering over the doorknob, wondering if he had made a mistake in coming back at all. But there was no turning back now. The whispers had followed him from the library, their presence in his mind like a constant hum in the background. They had grown louder in the past few hours, more desperate, more insistent. "Find him, the one who hurt us." Eric pushed open the door and stepped inside. The house felt different now, darker, colder. The air felt thick, almost suffocating, as if it had been waiting for him to return. The whispers were all around him, coming from every corner of the house, the crawl space, the walls, the very floors beneath his feet. He knew what he had to do. There was no more running. He had to go down there, into the crawl space, and confront whatever or whoever was waiting for him. The children were guiding him. They wanted justice. They wanted to be heard. He grabbed a flashlight from the kitchen drawer and made his way toward the basement. As he descended the stairs, the darkness seemed to grow deeper, as though the shadows themselves were closing around him. His breath came in shallow gasps, his heartbeat pounding in his ears. The air was thick with the smell of old wood and dust, and the quiet rustle movement behind the walls sent a chill down his spine. When Eric reached the crawlspace door, he stopped. His flashlight flickered, casting long, jittery shadows across the room. The door, sealed tight with nails and cement, was just as he had left it, but something was different now. The whispers were louder than ever before, and they seemed to be coming from inside the crawlspace, urging him to open it. His hand trembled as he reached for the crowbar he had left on the floor beside the door. With a forceful grunt, he began prying the nails loose, one by one. The sound of metal scraping against wood echoed through the basement, making his skin crawl. It felt like the house itself was protesting, as if it didn't want him to open the door. Finally, after what seemed like hours, the last nail came free. The door creaked open, revealing a narrow, pitch-black passageway beyond. The temperature dropped instantly, and the whispers grew louder, more frantic with each passing second. Eric's breath fogged in the cold air as he stepped forward, the beam of his flashlight cutting through the darkness. He crawled through the narrow opening, the air growing thicker with each inch he moved. The walls of the crawlspace felt as though they were pressing in on him, suffocating him with their proximity. But the whispers were undeniable now, louder, clearer, as though they were no longer just in his mind. They were coming from all around him. Find him, he's close, he's always been here. Eric's heart raced as he pushed forward, his flashlight flickering erratically. He couldn't explain it, but it felt like the walls were shifting, closing in on him, pushing him deeper into the darkened space. The further he went, the more the air seemed to hum with energy, a strange, electric sensation that made his skin prickle. And then, just as he thought he could take no more, the flashlight illuminated something on the ground, a small, dusty object. He crouched down, his fingers trembling as he picked it up. It was an old, faded photograph, crumpled at the edges but still intact. The image was yellowed with age, the faces worn and indistinct. Eric stared at it for a long moment, his mind racing. Then something clicked. The faces in the photograph were the children, the 5 children who had died in the fire. But there was something else in the picture. Someone else. A man. The figure was standing off to the side, half obscured in shadow, but his eyes were clear. And those eyes, those dark, piercing eyes. Eric's blood ran cold. It was him, the man from the witness account. The man who had been too close to the fire to escape. The man who had been described as blending into the night. The man who had watched it all unfold. He's here, Eric thought. He's been here all along. A cold wind swept through the crawlspace, extinguishing the light from his flashlight. The whispers grew louder, almost deafening now, swirling around him like a cyclone. His chest tightened and the air seemed to thicken, making it harder to breathe. The figure in the photograph, whoever he was, wasn't just a ghost of the past. He was real, and he was watching Eric now, too. Eric's heart pounded as he scrambled to his feet, but the crawlspace seemed to stretch on forever, the walls closing in tighter with each frantic movement. The whispers were no longer guiding him. They were mocking him. You'll never escape. Suddenly, a voice rang out, cutting through the noise. It wasn't a whisper. It was loud, deep, authority laced its tone. You should never have come here, the voice said. Eric froze, the hairs on the back of his neck standing on end. He turned, his flashlight flickering back to life, and in the dim light, he saw the figure standing before him, a man tall and shadowed, his face obscured by darkness. You're just like the others, the man said, his voice a low growl. You're here to die. Eric stumbled backward, his heart racing, his breath coming in short, panicked gasps. He had to get out. He had to get out now. But as he turned to flee, the crawl space seemed to stretch endlessly before him. The walls were closing in, narrowing, suffocating him. He couldn't breathe, couldn't move. His legs were frozen in place, his body numb. The man's footsteps echoed in the distance, growing closer, but when Eric looked back, there was no one there. The whispers were still there, though louder, angrier. "He's here, Eric. He's always been here." Eric turned in a frenzy, searching for an escape, but the darkness was all-consuming now. The voices were everywhere, pushing him forward, guiding him toward a fate he couldn't escape. In the distance, he heard the faintest sound, the sound of a door creaking open, the faintest footsteps echoing from somewhere far ahead. And then, just as the darkness swallowed him whole, the final whisper reached his ears. He's watching, always watching. The whispers grew louder, and with every passing second, the walls seemed to close in tighter, suffocating Eric. The truth that had been hidden for so long was now exposed, but in the end, the darkness claimed another victim. He thought he could escape, but the house had other plans. What was it that Eric uncovered down there in the crawl space? Was it just a tragic history of a long-forgotten fire, or was there something far darker at work? The whispers, they still haunt that house, echoing through the walls, guiding the next poor soul unlucky enough to step inside. As the camera fades to black, the haunting truth lingers. We may never know all the details of the past, but one thing is for certain, some secrets are better left undisturbed. And with that, we leave you to ponder what truly happened to Eric in that dark crawl space. Was he a victim of the house's curse, or was a true killer lurking somewhere, still watching, waiting? Thank you for joining us tonight on this unsettling journey. Remember, if you ever hear a whisper behind the walls, it might just be the voices of those who never left. Sleep well. This has been another chilling tale brought to you by Mr. Dar's Nights. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. And as always, keep the lights on or don't. The end.